The Great Depression in Japan. This video deals with the economic challenges that Japan faced between 1929 and the 1930s. This is the period of the Great Depression. In particular, it tries to make links between the Great Depression and the rise of militarism in Japan. This is an area that some of you will have difficulty because of how similar its impact is to Germany. There are similarities, but most importantly, there are also very important differences, especially with regard to rural Japan and its impact on politics. This topic is also difficult to understand due to the invisible forces at work in understanding economic forces. We hope this video helps you. The international situation in Japan. By the 1920s, Japan had suffered from a series of bank failures. The worst was the banking crisis of 1927, with 37 banks in Japan going bankrupt. Government measures restored some degree of confidence in Japan's banking system, but this all came crashing down with the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a worldwide economic recession caused by the New York stock market crash in 1929. It's called the Wall Street crash, and it affected many countries around the world, including Japan. The political impact. Between 1918 to the late 1920s, Japanese democratic institutions had become somewhat popular among the Japanese citizens. In 1929, all citizens could now vote. Politicians from the democratic parties placed their trust in a peaceful, stable, financial system based on global trade, which could ensure Japan's continued economic growth and its development as a world power. This all came crashing down with the Great Depression. With the Great Depression, communism and extreme right-wing, ultra-nationalist militarists came to power. Secret society groups like the Sakurakai, the Cherry Blossom Society, and the Kitsumeidan, the League of Blood, became popular. Demands for military expansion into Manchuria and later China became louder and louder, becoming popular ideas in Japan in the 1930s. So in order to understand the changing political situation, let's look at the impact of the Great Depression on Japan. This picture that you see is actually an image of a May 15 incident where even the Prime Minister was assassinated. We move on now to the impact on Japan's economy. The impact of the Great Depression on Japan as a whole was severe and long-lasting. Before the Great Depression, Japan was heavily dependent on global trade and exports for its economic success. The trade with the USA was especially important. The USA was Japan's largest trading partner, accounting for around 40% of Japan's total export overseas. This all ended in the 1930s. There was a large contraction, a tremendous shrinking of the Japanese economy caused by the Great Depression. GDP, or Gross Domestic Product of Japan, is the total amount of goods and services in Japan in that year. It fell by almost 20% between 1929 and 1931. Precise data is, however, lacking. Japan's main export was textiles, especially silk. This was very important for Japan and badly affected. In the 1920s, Japan was one of the world's largest producers of silk. Production of raw silk fell from around 23,000 metric tons in 1929 to about 13,000 metric tons in 1932. Almost 45% of its total production. The price of silk fell even more significantly. Silk products in 1929 were 370 million yen. In 1932, it had fallen to 160 million yen. This represents a decrease of over 50% in just 3 years. The Japanese government, led by democratic political leaders, tried to introduce a whole series of measures to try to revive the economy. They packed or tied their currency, the yen, to the price of gold. It didn't work. They devalued the Japanese currency. It didn't work. They tried to make exports cheaper and more competitive. It didn't work. They tried to increase government spending on public work projects, building government buildings and roads and other infrastructure. There was some degree of success here, but again, rising government debt and inflation dragged on. Japan's economy remained in depression until the mid-1950s as a whole. Let's talk about businesses shutting down and unemployment in Japan's cities and towns. As Japan's exports fell and demand for Japanese products declined globally, many factories and businesses, like the one that you see, were forced to close down or to cut back on their production. It led to widespread salary cuts of workers, then layoffs, and mass unemployment. In the cities, the textile industry was worst affected, especially silk production. Heavy industries like steel production, shipbuilding, and machine manufacturing were all badly affected. Many small businesses also shut down. Now, small businesses are important in Japan because they employed over 70% of the Japanese workforce. So when they shut down, millions became unemployed. These small businesses were family-owned shops selling grocery, stationery, Japanese ramen and other foods, restaurants, barbershops, photography studios, street vendors, and many others. So small-scale manufacturers like textile mills, pottery studios, metalworking shops, and small factories producing ceramics and other items and other artisans' crafts, they were all also shut down. And some historians believe that as many as 20% of Japan's workforce lost their jobs in this period. Now that's 1 in 5 people in Japan, and that's a very high employment rate. In the cities, there was also a large political impact. People struggled to find work and to provide for their families, and they placed the blame on greedy big businesses, or zaibatsus, and their close ties and corruption that was linked with democratic political parties. Even ordinary people who normally hated militarism were disappointed with their civilian-led governments. They said economic problems couldn't be solved by them. It was by this period that many of them became more sympathetic to extreme political groups like the militarists and other ultra-nationalist groups in Japan. What about rural Japan? What was the impact of the Great Depression on rural Japan? The impact of the Great Depression was also disastrous here. During the Great Depression, the falling price of agricultural products and falling demand for Japanese exports such as silk meant that farmers earned a lot less. They struggled to make ends meet. Many were involved in silk production, which was largely a rural enterprise, something done in the countryside. And when the Great Depression struck, many of those who produced rural silk products lost a means of earning income, and they fell heavily into debt. To make matters worse, in the 1930s, famine struck different parts of Japan. In 1934, there was the Hokkaido famine. It affected almost 200,000 people, and it led to several thousand deaths. In 1936, on Shikoku Island, there was poor harvest, slow government response, economic depression, and it all led to famines. In 1936, there was the Showa famine. Typhoons and floods affected the harvest, and government policies that tried to restrict and control rice imports led to tens of thousands dying. Some people estimate that the Showa famine led to as many as 200,000 deaths. According to one report by the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry in the 1930s, 4 officials that were sent to these places described the following conditions. Theft of food in some places had gone beyond the power of the local police to control. Money was so scarce that barter or exchange was used. Children were sold. A 15-year-old boy from a primary school was being sold for 400 yen. People also burnt their own farms and properties. so that they could get insurance money. Barnyard fodder and fish fertilizer were eaten as food to sustain life. Such incidents made the rural farmers bitterly resent landowners, banks, big businesses like the Zaibatsus and the democratic politicians, who didn't seem to be doing much. Many rural farmers felt that their country was spinning out of control, and the only way to restore order and harmony was through a nationwide return to traditional Japanese values based on discipline and, guess what? Militarism. So in conclusion, there you have it. The Great Depression led to economic hardships that some say led Japan on the path of militarism. The middle class and large segments of society were disillusioned and angered by the democratic parties and the Zaibatsus for not being able to solve their problems. There was poverty in the cities, in the rural countryside, rural discontent, and many looked to militarism as one of the possible solutions. In this period, the idea of having a strong authoritarian government, fiercely loyal to the emperor, with Japan rearming itself and hell-bent and intent on military aggression to gain colonies and access to resources, expansion into Manchuria, China, and later Southeast Asia, this all became popular ideas in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. This was the way to ensure for them Japanese continued economic growth and quest to be a world power.